The day has finally come. You guys don't know this, but this game is a big deal to me. No, that's an understatement. This is my favorite game of all time. So I really don't care if this video doesn't get any views. What matters more to me is that I actually do Spyro the Dragon justice. I played this game an insane amount of times, probably about once a year since I was 5 years old. Most people will barely play any game more than once, so I know it sounds crazy to play a game over 20 times. And yes, as you've probably guessed, it's mostly due to nostalgia. But if you love 3D platformers like me, I will defend Spyro to death as one of the greatest of all time. It's always in the shadow of the other big names of the era: Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, and of course, Crash Bandicoot. So I'm going to tell you why it's just as good as those other games, and why you owe it to yourself to play Spyro if you have the slightest interest in collectathons. I'm mostly going to use footage from the remake, as any of you younger viewers are probably going to be repulsed by shitty 90s graphics. Listen, 22 years ago this was impressive, alright? But I'll save your eyes from jagged polygons and muddy textures. The remake has its own problems, but we'll get to that later.
Oh, Spyro! You're not afraid of those big, noisy, gigantic, awful beasts, are you?
Of course not!
Oh, good. I didn't think so.
For whatever reason, in recent years I've heard a lot of people shitting on collectathons, often joking about having a million useless collectibles, and that was their only appeal. I especially noticed this when Yooka-Laylee came out, as many people, including myself, were rightfully disappointed at the game's mediocrity. But out of nowhere, there was this narrative that Banjo-Kazooie was just like this, these games were always bad and you're just blinded by nostalgia. Which is fucking bullshit, by the way. Maybe someday I'll tackle Yooka-Laylee, but for now, just know that the million collectible nonsense came from Donkey Kong 64. That game legitimately had a stupid amount of useless junk. As for Spyro, there's 3 main collectibles, which is probably about average, but honestly, just forget about all of that. Because ultimately, it doesn't really matter. At its core, the appeal of a collectathon is not much different than any 2D platformer. Smooth controls, variety in level design, visually and mechanically, exploration, and a sprinkle of challenge. That's all you need for a great 3D platformer. The exploration being the major divide between 2D and 3D, unless you count Metroidvanias as platformers. Spyro nails the first 3, and the 4th one not so much. The controls were top notch back in '98. If there was ever a category that Sony dominated Nintendo back then, it would be controls. Sure, in Super Mario 64 you had a lot of cool moves to choose from. Triple jump, side flip, back flip, long jump, wall jump, all of that's great, but the game handles like ass. I know some of you are pissed at me right now for saying that, but seriously, boot up your N64 and play it again. Part of the problem is the N64 controller, which might just be the worst controller of all time. Crash Bandicoot 2 and 3 control like butter in comparison, and Spyro is right up there with his older brother. Your moveset is incredibly simple. You can jump, glide, roll, shoot a small burst of fire, and charge forward with your horns. Outside of temporary power-ups, that's all you get for the whole game. And yet, that's all you need. Just having the power to glide fundamentally changes the platforming experience. I know this is getting into meme territory here, but as a kid you really felt like you were a young dragon that hadn't learned to fly yet.
Makes you feel eerily like Batman. The player really feel like Batman. Could not look or feel more Batman. Made us feel like we were feel like Batman. IGN, what did you think?
Arkham Asylum makes you feel like you're Batman.
Charging and flaming make up the basically non-existent combat. Since enemies in 3D platformers aren't obstacles to platforming, every enemy in Spyro has gems inside of them. So if you want that coveted 100%, you've got to take them all out. And they all die in one hit, so you can't really even call it combat. Metal enemies are immune to fire, and giant ones are immune to your horns. While charging, you move at twice your walking speed, and you can hold square infinitely with no penalty. So what I'm getting at here is that the more experienced you get at the game, the faster you can play it. Since I've played it like a million times, I'm essentially just holding square the whole time, only letting go to flame a big boy or glide across a gap. That's it. Spyro is a fairly short game as it is, and at this breakneck pace you can 100% it in less than 4 hours. The supercharged power-up cranks it to 11. Basically it turns you into Sonic as long as you don't crash into anything. You're completely invincible, and you can jump like 10 times as far. The level Treetops is built entirely around this concept, but we'll save that for later. The other power-up is the Fairies Kiss, which powers up your flame so that you can kill anything with it. Not too fancy, that one gets improved in the sequel.
Hey, what's on the other side of that river?
Why don't you glide there and find out?
To me, this is easily the most important part of a platformer. You can have the smoothest controls and most diverse movement known to man, but you need the memorable levels to back it up. And this is another area Spyro excelled at compared to his competition. Super Mario 64 has 15 levels, Banjo-Kazooie has 9 levels. Spyro has 29, all with unique assets and tracks. This gives each world a unique visual flair backed by an amazing soundtrack that has stuck with me my entire life. Spyro 1 specifically has such a unique atmosphere to it, most notably in the magic and dream themed worlds, that is lost in its sequels. It's hard to describe really, all I can say is that it feels like a moving painting. Just look at these backgrounds. Lofty Castle captures that feeling the most. Combined with the music, nostalgia just washes over me instantly. I'm just constantly impressed by Insomniac's dedication in their games to make every level unique and memorable in some way. This design principle later carried over to the Ratchet & Clank games, which I'm sure I'll talk about on this channel. As for the actual design layout of the levels themselves, there's really two types. The first is pretty standard. A circular landscape surrounded by water, mountains, or invisible walls in a couple cases, with a linear path that takes you through the circle. Think of Bob-omb Battlefield from Super Mario 64. That kind of thing. The second is a series of floating islands that you either glide between or use a supercharge ramp to reach. As this is a collectathon, expect a lot of secret pathways with hidden gems and dragons to rescue. The best example of old school level design that would never be made today is Dark Passage, an awesome nightmare themed levels with enemies that grow giant and demonic in the darkness. When you reach the end of the level, you realize that you've only collected half of the gems and dragons. How is that possible, you might ask yourself? Well, the entire second half of the level is reached through a secret path at the end. This blew my mind back then and still does today. Imagine a modern developer using that many resources on a part of the game less than half of the people who play it will ever see. It would never happen. Yet this is the entire appeal of this genre for me. Exploration and scratching that completionist itch. Spyro gave me that itch. Like I mentioned before, Treetops is the ultimate supercharge level. It's another island type level meant to simulate the top of massive trees, And the only way to reach all of the secrets is by combining multiple supercharge ramps in ways I didn't know were even possible as a kid. It makes you feel like an absolute badass when you pull them off too. I just love this level, it's just plain fun. Each world has a flight minigame level, and these are pretty simple. Just fly around and destroy a bunch of stuff in a time limit. A couple of them can be challenging the first time, but not too bad overall. They can be a nice break from the normal gameplay, but they don't add too much to the game. The bosses are without a doubt the worst part of Spyro. To even call them bosses feels like a disgrace to the term. They're basically just normal enemies that you have to flame a couple more times. Despite this, the levels themselves aren't bad at all, because they're just normal levels with a boss at the end. Metalhead is the only one with a unique mechanic, and has the best level built around him as well. But other than him, the others are just a mild distraction from your kleptomaniac quest. I haven't talked about game soundtracks in a while, probably because most game OSTs are ass, and I don't have any educational background in music, so it's hard for me to describe them in a technical fashion. But I have to talk about Spyro's. The soundtrack for the entire original trilogy was composed by Stuart Copeland, former drummer of The Police. And it's a shame that to this day, the Spyro soundtrack is still the only game series he has composed for, because that man is a goddamn musical genius.
Now let's get some heavy metal going here. Okay. They pay me for this.
There's not a single game out there that sounds like Spyro. Every single track in the first game is gold, and most of them in the third are great as well. This soundtrack is my childhood, man. If you play the remake, do yourself a favor and switch to the old soundtrack. The new one is alright, but just does not compare to the original, trust me. Speaking of the remake.
Watch the dragonfly, Spyro. His color indicates his power. When he eats butterflies, he stays strong, like me.
Sure.
Let me just start off by saying if you've never played Spyro before, feel free to play the remake because none of my problems with it will matter to you. So I'll cover the improvements first because that's what will matter the most to you guys. By far, the greatest addition to the remake is the redesign of all of the dragons. They did a fantastic job here. Out of 74 different dragons, the original only had about 10 to 15 unique models and the rest were palette swaps. In the remake, every single one has a unique design, even the ones that just say, "Thank you for releasing me."
Thank you for releasing me.
Thank you for releasing me.
The amount of effort that went into this is amazing to me, and proves that Toys for Bob actually cares about the franchise. Purists will probably argue that stylistically they don't really fit in with the rest of the game, especially Spyro himself, but it doesn't really bother me. All in all, a great addition. Tom Kenny was brought in to re-record all of the original lines. Most people know him for being the voice of SpongeBob, but he was also the voice of Spyro in the second and third game. So, fans of the original will notice that Spyro has lost a little bit of his 90s edginess, but is replaced with cat-like cute animations and a voice to match.
Nasty Nork has put one of his most devious henchmen in charge of the artisan world.
Bring him on. I think I smell a barbecue.
Nasty Nork has put one of his most devious henchmen in charge of the artisan world.
Bring him on. I think I smell a barbecue.
The controls were already pretty smooth before, but now they're super slick and responsive. Almost too responsive, honestly, but newcomers will be completely fine with this. The camera is now controlled with the right analog stick because 20 years ago the DualShock controller wasn't standard for PS1, so we had to use L2 and R2 to control the camera. It was horrible. Spyro can now flame much quicker in succession, which doesn't really change much, the game was easy enough already. By pressing L3, sparks will point to the nearest gem, a much needed addition to the remake because all of the added models and complex textures to the landscape often obscure gems. It gets to the point where even I had to use sparks almost every level because I missed a gem hidden in grass or in a dark corner somewhere. They also added skill points, a feature in the 2 sequels, and they're pretty alright. Really just achievement fodder. And that's about it for improvements. Now for the negatives. Toys for Bob took a lot of artistic liberties with the remake. I don't know if it was to save time on making assets, which actually I would bet is the most likely reason given that they were clearly rushed to complete the game. Case in point, the trilogy was delayed for 6 months, and Spyro 3 was developed entirely by a different company, Sanzaru Games. I actually don't completely blame them for this. Activision clearly needed the game to come out in 2018, and the Spyro games feature a lot more diverse environments than the Crash games, so they did the best they could. But still, some of these design choices are inexcusable. Just look at Lofty Castle, they completely fucked up the color scheme and slapped a purple filter on as a band-aid fix. But the worst one, and this was completely intentional, was the absolute butchering of Twilight Harbor. All in the name of protecting the children.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Basically, the original level had the Norks use assault rifles and grenades, and it was badass, man. I loved this shit as a kid. These dorky little frog orc people had pump-action rifles, which in itself is very goofy. But of course, we can't glorify guns in a kid's game. I guarantee you that 90% of the people who bought the remake were the people who grew up with it. The irony is that children play Call of Duty, a rated M game, because parents don't give a shit what their kids play. I was 5 years old when I played Spyro, and did the guns fuck me up? No, because why would it? This whole thing is just stupid. Even if it bumped the game up to a teen rating, do you think that would affect sales? No. No, it absolutely wouldn't, and I refuse to believe otherwise until someone could provide me with some concrete data. Alright, well, aside from that, the only other problems with the game is that it can be a bit glitchy. Physics were added to the gems, meaning they now have a tendency to get stuck on walls or in the air, and sometimes sparks won't grab them. Also, one time an enemy clipped straight through the ground, and I had to die to get him to respawn so I could grab the last gem. Ultimately, the glitches don't affect the experience much, but it's a shame that they haven't been patched nearly 2 years later.
You're toast, Nork.
The few of you who have watched this channel from the beginning may have noticed a similarity in most of my outros. Some were more blatant than others, where I just straight up used Spyro gameplay, but for most of the rest I used a track from Spyro to close things out. Not just because I think the soundtrack is great, but because I love this game. Spyro the Dragon is the reason I love video games. It's not perfect, far from it, but it represents a time when video games only had to do one thing and do it well. And I miss those days. It was honestly a much better time that most Zoomers will never experience. I'm starting to sound like one of those 90s kids, and I promise you I'm not. I just call it like I see it. So if you're a teenager who wants to experience a piece of the past, or a millennial who wants to find a missing piece of his childhood, give Spyro a shot. The Reignited trilogy is perfect for any newcomers, and all 3 of the games are good, though I've got some beef with the third. Some of you might be a little disappointed in their simplicity, but to me that's their greatest strength. So take a seat, rescue some dragons, collect some gems, and roast some thieves. And from the bottom of my heart, thanks for watching. Hey guys, give the video a like, it helps with the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more reviews. I did want to say really quick that I know some of you were upset with the Ghost of Tsushima review, and I'll admit I was a little harsh on it, but I stand by what I said. It's a good game, maybe even a great game, but it's not a masterpiece by any stretch. My title was a little clickbaity, but I think I got the point across. Anyway, next video will either be a GameCube game or a PS3 360 game. I'll probably put another poll up. See you next time, guys.